Ahoy there! Captain Benzie here, coming at you from inside the Fulmination Content Creator Test Server with another Tech 10 Battleship review video. Today we're going to be looking at the Amarr Empire Abaddon. This is following on from, of course, the Gallente Federation Hyperion and the Minmatar Republic Maelstrom. I'll put links to both of those in the description down below in case you're interested. Now, basically, I'm not normally a fan of Amarr ships, but I've got to hand it to the Abaddon. This thing really does look beefy. It looks exactly like you would expect a battleship to. You've got a big brace of weaponry down each side, full broadsides there to go with. It is just round and tanky and looks like it means business, which makes it significantly more attractive to fly than, for example, the Apocalypse, which I know is a very popular ship, but still looks a little bit too phallic for my tastes. Anyway, in today's video then, we're going to be taking a look at this ship, talking about what makes it special, how you can fly it, and what kind of content you can expect to be able to push with this. If you do enjoy this video, please let me know by hitting a like on it, sub to the channel for all things Eve Echoes, making sure to ding that notification bell so that you never miss an update. I am putting out videos every day at 1700 UTC, Monday to Friday. 5 videos a week. And if you want to help support this channel by going the extra mile, you can do so by joining us on Patreon and indeed our Redbubble merchandise store, links for both of which are in the description down below. Anyway, that is enough of the preamble. Let's jump into talking about the Amarr Empire Abaddon. Like the Gallente Federation Hyperion and Minmatar Republic Maelstrom, which we've already covered in other videos, check the description down below, and the Caldari State Rock, which you can bet your biscuit we'll be covering in a future video, the Amarr Empire Abaddon is one of the 4 Tech 10 tanky battleships. Now, that's not an actual technical term for them, it's just the phrasing that I like to use, because the Hyperion and the Maelstrom both have bonuses to armor repairers and shield boosters, respectively, and the Rock gets a bonus to its shield resistance, whereas here, the Abaddon gets bonuses to its armor resistance. You can kind of see there are parallels between these 4 battleships, and that's why I'm kind of covering them in this little mini-series. Now, I do apologise for the flickering here. When NetEase do eventually get round to adding the 60 FPS patch, that should be fixed. Now, as I've mentioned, the Abaddon actually does look really cool, not that you can see it from all this flickering. I really like the look of this one, especially when we start looking at some of the nanocores. I've used the Blood Raider Veteran nanocore on this for the time being, as we'll discuss later, only because the Blood Raider's NCO nanocore is not currently available in the game, curiously. I just love the look of this, giving it that full sort of mottled, blood-covered look of the standard Blood Raider ships. To me, is just amazing. And yeah, you could go for like the Sancha versions, but let's be fair, they're just not nearly half as cool. Look at it, it's just, there's no real competition. Is there Sancha NCO or Blood Raider NCO? You're gonna want the Blood Raider. Anyway, let's get rid of that flickering and talk about the actual ship itself, rather than just how it looks. So, the Abaddon, like the other tanky battleships, has a fitting profile of 8 high slots designed for large weaponry, 4 mid slots, and 6 low slots. We've then got 3 combat rigs and 3 engineering rigs, along with 2 drone tubes that can launch small, medium, large, or sentry drones. Now, we've talked about this before, there's really no reason to ever put sentry drones in this, I would argue, unless you really want to go for the sniping fit, but I just don't get it. I tend to go for medium drones, just because medium drones have insanely good application against small targets, whilst still doing good DPS to larger targets. Yeah, you can go for large drones, but you kind of struggle to hit the smaller stuff at that point. Anyway, we have a very high defense here, 105,337, very high amount of hit points. Most of that is, of course, in the armor tank. This is an Amarr ship, and I kind of get the feeling that Amarr and armor being so similar as words was by design. But anyway, 33,395 hit points in armor, a decent amount in structure there, 27,283, not much at all in the way of shields, so do expect to lose the Abaddon's shields fairly quickly. We've got a very high power grid here, 13,972. That is large enough for everything we could want it for. You're not going to be fitting capital-sized modules on here, don't bother, but for actual, sort of large modules, you'll be more than comfortable with that power grid. We've also got a pretty aggressive capacitor, 16,684 gigajoules, good recharge rate, very fast recharge time for a ship of this size. Yeah, it's an Amarr ship. They always have good capacitors. Of course, they need it because they're going to be powering lasers. Lasers naturally chew through a lot of capacitor. Typical Tech 10 maximum lock targets of 7, very high signature radius of 285.2 meters, very low scan resolution of 120mm, means you are going to take a little bit of time to lock on to anything smaller than sort of a battle cruiser. Flight velocity is middling for sort of a battleship. It's not the fastest out there, like you're not going to keep pace with a Typhoon anytime soon, but it's not the slowest either. It's an Amarr ship, so it kind of gets that middle ground there. 136 meters per second. A 2.0 AU per second warp speed is standard for a battleship, and its mass and inertia means that it is fairly clunky at turning. Takes a little bit of time to align and warp away, so that's something you are going to have to bear in mind. Looking at the trait description though, this is where the magic really happens for the Abaddon. Now I mentioned it's one of the 4 Tech 10 tanky battleships, and as we saw, Advanced Battleship Command here gives us a plus 4% armor resistance per level of training, 20% additional armor resistance at full training. So like the Caldari Rock, getting the same there but on shield. This is a very tanky ship because of this, because it just pushes those bonuses all the way up and means, well, it's less damage taken, you know? We then have Advanced Large Laser Operation, giving us a 10% increase to large laser damage and a 7.5% increase to large laser optimal range. Now again, like we talked about with some of the other of these ships, this does really benefit both beam lasers and pulse lasers. If you want to go for a sniping fit, absolutely you can do. You're going to get 50% extra damage out of those beam lasers, and the optimal range of those is going to be pushed even further. That said, looking at the tracking of the large pulse lasers, plus the fact that this optimal range boost really actually pushes their range to some quite insane levels, plus the tankiness of the Abaddon, means to me that this works better with pulse lasers, and that's exactly what I'm going to be fitting to it. Spoiler alert for the fitting section, I guess, because I think a ship that has tanking bonuses like this is designed really to take damage. The mark of a brawling ship is things like either bonuses that are directly aimed at the shorter range weaponry, or things that are just designed to kill a target faster whilst making yourself more survivable. It's a full-on DPS race. You just kill everything before you die, and you're not going to die in an Abaddon unless you were jumped by a particularly nasty fleet, or you're just really not paying attention. Anyway, let's jump ahead and have a look at the fitting section. Before we begin the fitting section, as with all of my fits, this is not meant to be a be-all and end-all. I'm not telling you that this is the best fit for the Abaddon. It's probably not, and I don't think there is such a thing as a best fit. I think there's a best fit for your particular playstyle, and so this is just a starting point. This is a place that I enjoyed using the Abaddon at, a fit that I found worked for me. You might decide that actually you've got different goals, different playstyles, different skills. You want to tweak things to fit your situation. I absolutely encourage that, and I'd love to hear what fit you're running on your Abaddon down below. When I was doing this video and putting it all together, I spoke to a lot of different Abaddon pilots, looked at their fits, figured out why they work, and asked them why they use a particular fit. They all had different fits, they all had different reasoning. I would love to hear what your fit and your reasoning is in the comment section below. There were 3 simple goals I had in mind when putting this fit together. First of all, it is primarily designed for PvE ratting. As such, survivability is our most important stat up to the point that we can clear the toughest PvE content. Once we were capable of clearing that content, I could tweak downwards, make sure that I was still able to survive the content, but push more into DPS to increase the speed at which I could clear that content, thus improving ISK per hour. The second consideration was that it needed to be fairly cheap. I wasn't going to be throwing together something that required X-type modules and top-tier fully leveled up nanocores. This one does rely on a nanocore, as we'll talk about in a moment, but ultimately it was designed to be as accessible a build as possible, so that once you'd built your Abaddon, you should probably have no trouble getting this fit. It was aspirational but fairly easy to achieve. The third and final thing to consider for me was that this was going to be a brawling fit. Because the Abaddon has such brilliant skills involved in sort of survivability and damage output, it seemed clear to me that this was going to be a get up close and personal, brawl and punch them in the face with laser beams, and so that's what we've aimed at. Before we look at the actual fit itself, please remember I am on the Fulmination Content Creator test server for this demonstration, therefore I have 555 in every single skill available in Eve Echoes. If you're looking at my weapons and your weapons and wondering why mine do more damage, that may be why. Anyway, let's actually have a look at the fit. So for the high slots, taking into consideration that this is for ratting and we're going for a brawling build, of course we're using C-type large pulse lasers. Doesn't matter if they're Corpus or Centi, both are exactly the same. Now, if we have a look at this, you'll see that these are monstrous. We've got really good DPS, 216 per turret. We've got an exceptional optimal range of 43.31 kilometers, and we actually have a decent tracking speed of 7.24. Now, that we'll talk about a bit more later on, but I have gone for pulse lasers purely because of that tracking speed. Because I'm going to be getting close, I want to be able to blap everything that gets nice and close to me. I am going to be having issues with things like interceptors and the Explorer frigates at Tech 10, so I need to take that into consideration. Having a high tracking speed is the best way to do it, or rather having the higher tracking speed between beams and pulses was the point. Now, beyond this, of course, I need to be able to hit that target, and that 7.24 tracking speed is not going to be sufficient on its own, which is why we have 3 Predator Stasis Webifiers. These can be put onto a target. 2 is often enough, but certainly if you were to get jumped by an interceptor, a 3rd Predator Stasis Webifier means that you are suddenly capable of actually hitting that target, and the damage you can put out means you will probably 1, 2, or 3 volley him depending on your DPS. For me, that means I didn't really need to worry too much about something like a scram or a disruptor to hold them there. I'm not going for PvP kills, I just want to be able to defend myself if someone comes in. Of course, you could swap one of these Stasis Webifiers for a Newt. Obviously the Newt doesn't help for PvE though, which is why I left that out. You might decide that that's a better option for you if you're worried about getting jumped by frigates and things, then hitting them with a large neutralizer is a great way to scare them off. I wanted to remain cap stable because I'm going PvE. I wanted to have as little input required into actually flying this. I could just watch it happen basically. A Vrikalakras large energy Nosferatu helps me do that. And if you're wondering how I've got such a high energy transfer amount there, that comes down to the nano core here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I would love to have the Blood Ranger NCO nano core because it looks amazing. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear to be in the game at the time of me making this video. As such, I've gone for the Blood Raider Veteran Core because I want that energy Nosferatu absorption efficiency. Basically, more energy being restored to your own capacitor. Helps me maintain capacitor stability in a laser ship using just 1 Nosferatu and no battery in the low slot. Speaking of low slots, I've primarily gone for 2 Corpus C-type large armor repairers because I'm a big fan of dual armor reps. I think dual armor repping is the way forward with most armor rep ships. It just means that you can go with the amount of resistance that you have and just repair comfortably without worrying too much about your capacitor because of the amount of capacitor that these actually use up compared to shield. I have still gone for 2 adaptive armor hardeners. Some people go for 1 rep and 3 hardeners. Because the Abaddon already has some nice resistance bonuses, the 3rd armor hardener seemed a bit overkill to me personally, and I'm finding that the 2 repairers is more than sufficient for the content that I'm clearing. This left me with 2 open low slots, and there are a couple of different considerations. The easiest option here was just to go for some C-type heat sinks, purely to pick up our DPS, to kick that DPS up a notch. Both of these active will mean that I'm doing well over 2,200 DPS for the duration of their activation. I think it's actually close to 2,400. Which obviously helps me clear anomalies that little bit faster. That said, I know some people do swap one of these for a capacitor battery. Some people have put even things like armor plates and that on here just to really bump up the EHP here of the Abaddon. You could go for a propulsion unit. Even tracking computers aren't necessarily a bad idea, especially if you want to swap that mid slot to another Nosferatu or something instead there because you don't want to use the Blood Raider nanocore, or you want to use a straight up DPS nanocore. If you go for that, then you're probably going to want an additional Nosferatu in your mid slots, at which point you can replace the Webifier with something like a tracking computer. This brings us then to the rigs. Now, first of all, survivability, as I said, was our primary concern, so I've gone from an auxiliary nano pump that means the armor repairers repair an additional 30%, which is just nice. We then have an anti-explosive pump, just so that if we're going up against anything that deals explosive damage, it's not doing an untoward amount of damage to us. We don't have a resistance hole, so to speak. And then I've gone for a laser collision accelerator. Lasers are actually one of the weapons in the game that I don't necessarily go for laser collision and laser burst, like I would with, say, cannons or railguns. Tend to go, you know, burst and collision there for optimum DPS. And this is because lasers obviously use capacitor, and thus if you speed up how quickly a laser fires, you are going to use more capacitor. Therefore, the collision accelerator to me is the best way forward, and if you are going to be going up against content that isn't exactly high on explosive damage, you can swap the anti-explosive pump here for another laser collision accelerator. I've then gone for my typical battleship setup for engineering rigs of a capacitor control circuit and semiconductor memory cell just to help with stability. Capacitor, after all, is life. No capacitor means death. Simple as that. So I like to try and keep my capacitor as stable as I can. The third one I go for is a targeting system subcontroller, just so I can lock onto things a little bit faster. Again, this comes down to wanting to clear PvE content that little bit quicker, but you could go for something like a warp core optimizer in case you think you're going to be jumped. It's a great way to get out of combat. You might even sacrifice one of the memory cells or the one of the capacitor rigs there for a couple of extra ones of those to make sure you can get your getaway, but just be aware that that will of course affect your capacitor stability, and you can see it is a pretty stable capacitor at this point in time. Good targeting there as well. You can see scan resolution is now up at 203. It's enough that we can lock on with some decent speed, and I didn't mean to close that down. I keep doing that recently in videos. Basically, the point I'm getting at here is this is the fit that I'm using, but there are plenty of things here that you could quite comfortably swap out to fit what you want to use. I find that this works really well. It's sufficient for me to hit the smallest frigates very comfortably in PvE content, and it's sufficient that it will tie down a standard interceptor. Someone flying something like a Condor 2 interceptor jumps you in an anomaly or an encounter, you are going to be able to fire back if you don't want to run. Obviously, tweak it if running is what you think you could go for. Heck, you could even go for aura warp stabs there instead of the heat sinks for all I care. Again, let me know your thoughts and opinions on what fit you're running in the comment section below. Otherwise, let's jump into actually having a look at this in combat. Like the Hyperion and Maelstrom before it, I've warped the Abaddon in here at 0 kilometers. I've activated all our tanking modules. Well, I say all. One of the armor repairers is running currently, because that's pretty much all it needs for the first load of waves. And I'm just shooting at everything, starting with the smallest and working my way up. We are, of course, also doing Bad Hair Day, and of course I know some people are going to say, hang on Benzie, is this really a fair demonstration? Of course it's going to do well in Bad Hair Day. Bad Hair Day is entirely shield tanked and you're using lasers. Well, my argument would be, yeah, of course. If you've got something like a battleship and you're using it for encounter running, why wouldn't you be doing the encounters that it finds easiest and are just as lucrative as the others? Anyway, so here we are, Bad Hair Day. We're in the final wave of the first section here. We've got an elite Hare and other bits and pieces like that now. You'll see that I have upped to 2 of the armor repairers. Both the armor repairers are now active at the start of this wave, and we're doing absolutely fine with it. I'm also having no trouble even taking out things like the elite Pithy Heron. That was just the Heron Covert Ops there, small, fast-moving ship. We've got 3 webs, but I only actually had 2 on it, I think, at the time. Not a problem at all. Now you can see that I've basically been doing this the entire run. I got into the anomaly, I activated the 2 armor hardeners, I waited until I was about down to my at the bottom of the shield tank before activating 1 armor repairer, and this is the first time in this fight that I've even had to activate the second one. And you can see that first of all our capacitor is sitting comfortably at over 50%. It's sort of dancing around that 50% mark at the moment, and that is with 2 of the armor repairers running, and all 3 stasis webifiers, plus me using the heat sinks here pretty much on every cooldown. So I'm just jumping between the ships, shooting at the smallest ones when I can, and usually one-shotting them off the grid with, like, you know, a single turret activation, but if not, they go down very, very quickly. Here you can see that Pitham Ferox 2, there it goes, it's all the way through into its armor already, halfway through its armor. And this is why I say it doesn't really matter. Yes, of course, lasers are better against shields than they are against armor, but you can see they still chew through the armor and that pretty effectively. Now, ultimately, I found that this build works absolutely fine throughout all of this, that it's nice and tanky, I'm doing a good amount of damage thanks to those heat sinks, and I have no issues whatsoever hitting the smaller ships. In fact, if I lock fast enough, the first couple of ships tend to literally just get blatted off the grid with just 4 turrets, so at the start of a wave, I'll often take something like a Heron Explorer and a Condor 2 Interceptor here out in that first volley. Both of those are just gone. If not in the first volley, then the drones are usually enough to finish them off. Beyond that, though, you can see I've got no issues dealing damage to anything. We are pretty capacitor stable, and very soon I'm going to turn off that second armor repairer, because we're comfortable there going through. The 3 webs, ultimately, you might decide 3 webs is not the best option for you. You want to be a bit more cap stable, and you can swap that then for second Nosferatu. Then I would probably swap one of the heat sinks either for probably something like a tracking computer, just to help keep on top. And that does actually seem to work pretty well. You sometimes miss a few times, but you will eventually hit. If you're in a PvP-centric area, if there's a likelihood of you being jumped by an actual pilot-controlled interceptor, definitely stick with the 3 webs and then just swap one of the heat sinks for a capacitor battery if you think you really need to. Of course, you can also swap the third web for a large energy neutralizer. That's a great way of shutting down an interceptor jumping into your anomaly. Obviously, if it's just the one. Keep an eye on local, and if you see that there's a whole bunch of people just warped in, yeah, you might want to take some safety. But ultimately, this is kind of proving my point about lasers. I think lasers as a weapon system are just insanely powerful. Yes, they are exceptional at cutting through shields, but even here going up against this Pith Raven Striker, you'll see they do still solid damage against the armor. We're doing a good amount of DPS here. Yes, this is with the heat sinks double activated, admittedly, which pushes us to about 2,200 DPS, I think. But it's more than enough to chew through the armor. Most importantly as well, if I move on to this Elite Pith Scorpion, that's sitting at 29 kilometers. Whereas both the Maelstrom and the Hyperion before it, that's now outside of optimal range. Here, with these large pulse lasers, that's still inoptimal. The optimal range of these is something stupid like 48 kilometers. So basically anything up to 50 kilometers away, I'm doing essentially full damage against. And lasers, I was trying to explain this on Reddit the other day. Essentially, their paper DPS sometimes looks a little bit lower than some of the other weapon systems, by which I mean if you open up your fitting panel and actually have a look at the DPS stat there, it sometimes appears lower than you would get for, say, the equivalent in cannons or in railguns, so the snub-nosed railguns or autocannons. Yeah, that you can see that optimal range, 43 kilometers. It's insane. But it does apply that ridiculously well, whereas with the snub-nosed railguns and autocannons, you're probably in accuracy fall-off for the most time, so even though the numbers may look slightly higher, you're actually doing less than that. Lasers just are an incredibly powerful system, and I do want to kind of showcase this actually in a future video where we look at, for example, the Caracal 2, the Stabber 2, and the Omen 2. The Vexor 2 doesn't really come into play there, but just to showcase how well lasers can actually apply their damage. But anyway, that's a different topic for a different time. So here we have it, the Abaddon quite comfortably just parked there. For the most part, you can just put the webs on and just sit back and AFK through the content. Keep an eye on the screen, obviously, but you will just auto-target and just blap through everything. When a big wave spawns, you might want to activate the second armor repairer just for a little bit of time. But in fairness, testing has shown that I can let basically one armor repairer do the job. It will get me all the way, you know, I'll drop to about 20-25% armor, but then the amount of damage coming in gets reduced and the armor does gradually fill back up. So you can get away with one. I'm just a big fan of the dual armor rep setup, because again, it means if you are jumped or you suddenly take a little bit of extra damage, you can actually get away with it. And yes, I know this is only the first half of Bad Hair Day. It's just easier for me to jump into this and showcase it than it is to sort of try and spawn Tech 10 Inquisitors and Scouts and things like that. but this is a stable ship for ratting in any of those situations. The damage you can do is respectable, your tank is absolutely extreme, and you're surprisingly nimble if you do need to get out of there, though I would probably just pre-align and prepare yourself to sort of point in that direction and jump if you need to at a moment's notice. Your actual alignment doesn't really matter, but I mean just keep the camera pointed at what you're going to be warping to if you're moving at 0 meters per second. It's a great way to do it. The big advantage of brawling like this as well, one thing I haven't mentioned in the Maelstrom or in the Hyperion video, is that if I were to zoom this out, you'll see that all of the wreckage is actually really close to my ship. It's all within sort of 20 to 30 kilometers, which, considering I've got no propulsion module fitted here on the Abaddon, means I can actually loot surprisingly quickly. By comparison, obviously, if I'm sitting in something that's at 100 or 200 kilometers away and I'm blapping things with long-range weaponry, it's a much longer time for me to fly in, loot everything, and then warp out to actually finish the encounter. But hey, there we go. That is the Abaddon. I really like this ship, and yes, that's saying something considering it is an Amarr battleship. I think this is a really good option. Okay, it doesn't have quite the firepower of things like, for example, the Apocalypse Striker, but it does so well on that tankiness. You can just feel comfortable doing whatever content you like to without having to worry about whether or not you might lose this ship. It is tanky. Even if you do accidentally get jumped by a roam, chances are you can tank them for long enough for help to actually arrive. Just, you know, keep help nearby. Anyway, folks, let me know your thoughts and opinions on the Abaddon in the comment section down below. Let me know if there's a particular ship you would like me to cover in a future video. Otherwise, happy sailing, and see you in New Eden.